All right, it's time to start here. Come on in, have a seat. My name is Nancy Hobelheinrich, Knowledge Motifs, LLC. I am the co-I for the IMLS project that works with the Data Management Training Clearinghouse. And Carl just left. Carl just left me here for the front. He'll be back because he had to have his picture taken at this exact moment. So, so I'm starting the session for us, and welcome everyone. Glad you could be here. Our session here is designed to be part of the goals of the clearing of the IMLS grant, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. But what we're interested in getting feedback as well as presenting information. So I'll go ahead and get started with that. And let's see, Ellie, you're working with the online too, right? Yeah, okay, sounds good. So if there are questions that come up, let us know about that. All right, so I'm assuming people are already aware of the Data Management Training Clearinghouse. Is that true? Anybody need an explanation of what that is? We've heard enough about it so far in the last couple of years. Everyone knows what we're talking about? Yes, okay. One of the things that we've managed to do with the clearinghouse is to receive an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant, a national leadership grant that had a couple of goals associated with it for enhancing the clearinghouse. And this particular session that we're setting up today, and to which you are present, is to feed some insights into the content assessment plan and to find a way to provide or develop or use an assessment framework for the content that's in the clearinghouse. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So first of all, as I mentioned, this is part of the agenda as well as some introductions. So I'm Nancy. We've also got Carl, hopefully will come back in time to do his presentation. And Patrick Chandler is here from the Clean Network, and Sophie Howe from Roden Institute. Thank you. And then we definitely hope for some group discussion. So first of all, I guess we've got enough people in here that we could have time for a little bit of introductions. I don't know if people want to come up close to do just a minute or two. Oh, there's Carl. Hello, Carl. To give us your name, affiliation, and then what you're interested in interest is in this project. We just want to find out from people. We've got a lot of advisory board members here too, but other people we'd like to hear who you are so we can have a better conversation. So, Bill, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Bill Mishner with the University of New Mexico, and I'm on the advisory board for this project and been interested in data management education for many years.
I'm Amber Budden. I am with Data One, and I lead the community engagement and outreach activities that includes training. And so I've been affiliated with this project for many years.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophie Howe. I'm with the Roden Institute, and I'm here today to talk about a project that I actually work with Amber on, and you'll hear about it later, but I'm very interested in actually usability of data services, and especially in an education capacity, not just for maybe depositor or data producers or data users, but also how do we make data training or data education more user accessible and user friendly, and that's my interest area. Thanks.
Thanks, Ellie. And don't forget to introduce yourself. But I'm Patrick Chandler, based at the University of Colorado Boulder as a PhD student focused on science communication in a lot of different realms. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network and the framework through which we organize the resources for educators.
Hi, I'm Madison Langseth with the U.S. Geological Survey, and part of what my group does is provide educational resources on data management for USGS researchers. So very interested in this topic.
Hi, my name is Tamar Norkin, also with the USGS, and I'm in Madison's group, Science Data Management. Also work closely with USGS researchers.
Hello, Kevin Ward, NASA Earth Observatory and NASA Earth Science Data Systems. My interest here is I'm aware of DMTC, but I'm interested in how assessment is being directed toward these kinds of activities. How we are looking at how materials get evaluated and how they eventually then make their way to the end users.
Hi, I'm Cindy Hall, and I'm also with NASA's Earth Science Data Systems program, and interested in similar to what Kevin was saying, how we're assessing these types of resources.
Hi, I'm Stace Bolio. I'm from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and I guess I would be considered a content creator for the Data Management Training Clearinghouse. We created a curriculum for data science training for the ocean sciences, and I see, well, actually, I don't know if I put my materials into the clearinghouse yet. I was going to search for them. And I'm interested in using the clearinghouse as a means to provide my materials to the outside world. And thus, I'm interested in how metrics of how I would know how they were being used.
Hi, I'm Shelly Olds. I work at UNAVCO, which is in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm also a PhD student at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The connection here is I used to work with the DLISI, which was the Digital Library for Earth Science Education. Wow, that doesn't slip off the tongue anymore. It's been a while. And so I was part of groups that were developing different assessment frameworks. But it also comes to mind that I know UNAVCO has created a number of data training pieces, and it might be good if we could put them in.
My name is Rama Priyan. I've been working in data management for more years than I can remember as I'm getting older. But I work for Science Systems and Applications Incorporated these days, supporting the NASA Earth Science Data Information System project. And I believe I've contributed a number of pointers to the training materials that the project has produced, which now appear, I believe, in the Data Management Clearinghouse. I had provided them, 3 or 4 years ago to Nancy.
My name is Ziheng Sun from George Mason University, and our center is maintaining several clearinghouse services for the GEO and the sales and NASA. So we are always training our users to use our services, and we are very interested in this topic.
Okay, so my name is Rory Edmonds. I'm the acting executive director of the World Data System. The World Data System has become increasingly interested in research data management training and also providing such training. One of the things we did a couple of years ago was to ask our members what training materials they actually had, and we created a resource guide that is actually now part of the DMT Clearinghouse.
Hi, I'm Catherine Kramer, and I'm from Associated Universities, Inc., and we have a poster outside. I look forward to talking to you all more later about our Nereid project, which is about the intersection of earth science and space science data, and there's a big emphasis on education and outreach as part of that project. Wearing another hat, I also have for the last 4 or 5 years been working with the Northeast Big Data Hub on data literacy. That, of course, applies to earth science data as well as all kinds of data. And before that was worked on network literacy education, and before that, ocean literacy education, including with Hui at one point. So I look forward to talking with you after this. So about 20 years of work in science education outreach. That's kind of my focus. So I'm really looking forward to this session. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to,
You had
yes.
to remind him.
No.
I'm Ellie Davis. I'm a community fellow here with the Ag and Climate Cluster, and I'm doing my PhD at the University of South Carolina in geography. And I've often been on the training side and then also on the somewhat creation of training information side, though I realize that none of our stuff is in the clearinghouse, so maybe it should be. So I'm interested in this session.
And now we've got a couple of new folks coming in. We asked to introduce yourselves.
So we actually had headed out to the other teacher workshop, which is going to be later, but I'm Wedemeyer, working with the Coral Reef Science and Cyber Infrastructure Network and related projects with EarthCube, and making realistic and useful materials available for the community is so important. We've got to figure out how to do it better. So appreciate the opportunity.
Hello, I'm Agbili Amiko. I'm at NCAR, and we're working on making these 3D printed weather stations that we deploy in with indigenous communities. And part of our goal is not only to work with students and communities on engineering and working with Raspberry Pis on these 3D printed weather stations, but we're also running WRF, sort of a weather model on these stations, so that gives sort of an introduction to computer modeling and computational thinking.
Great, thank you. And I want to provide a belated welcome, and I apologize for my late entry. I'm Carl Benedict from the University of New Mexico and the University Libraries. I'm the PI on the Institute of Museum and Library Services project that is one of the drivers for organizing this session. I'm excited that you were able to come and join us, as I was unexpectedly called upstairs at the beyond the last minute. Oh, and the meeting grabbed the screen again. There we go. So I'm going to hand it off to Nancy to provide a little bit of context about the project that we're currently working on, and particularly our assessment focus. And then we'll provide a number of introductions to some different assessment frameworks that we want to hopefully bring into then our discussion around assessment of, and particularly the materials that are in the clearinghouse in the context of what we're talking about today.
Great, thank you, Carl. All right, so one thing that I wanted to mention right away based on some of the comments that people have made is that we are not at this moment doing any assessment of the content that's in the clearinghouse. So a lot of people have asked for that, and that's one of the main reasons we're approaching this question, but also and therefore why it was written into the grant. So we're at a beginning stage. We've had a working group that's sort of a subset of the advisory board that's been discussing it to some extent. We've got some idea of scope and parameters, but not approach so much. We've talked a little bit about it, and that's part of what we're interested in finding out, talking with you all about today, and to bring you up to where we are and get feedback. So just to give a context for the kinds of resources that are in the clearinghouse that relate to assessment. First of all, the clearinghouse itself is a collaboration between 3 different organizations, USGS, Data One, and ESIP. When we started in 2012 discussing this, we each had educational resources related to research data management, and we wanted to continue that work, but also bring it together because the researchers, the people who were interested in, who might be interested in using those, could not necessarily find them because they were in separate kind of silos. And so we thought bringing them together in one aggregated place would be a good thing. And it turns out it was a good thing. So thanks to USGS, we were able to get a small grant to do the first implementation. That started in 2015, and we launched in October of 2016. So thanks to USGS for that seed funding, and for ESIP who hosts it, which hosts it. It's on a Drupal platform, so it's a content management system, and what you see here on the screen is the homepage of it. If you have not looked at it, the URL is down at the bottom and is on all of these pages. So Once we got it launched, we were able to receive a grant, as I mentioned, and Carl mentioned, from the Institute of Museum and Library Services in 2000. That started in July of last year. And there were 4 areas of focus for enhancement. One was enhancing metadata and the search mechanism for finding the resources, adding some sort of assessment to the content, and then broadening the diversity and the quantity, broadening the diversity of the content from just earth sciences, not just earth sciences, to broader realms, but also from other geolocations as well, knowing that data is managed differently with different formats and different disciplines and cross disciplines, and then the quantity of the content as well. So you can see with the grid on the side here that once we started with 35 in 2016, and we're now up to actually we're beyond 350 resources that are in the clearinghouse now. And one thing that's important to note is that these are curated, so they're not necessarily something that people just dump in, so to speak. We do look at them and look for quality, and there's a process we go through to actually get them published, which I'll talk about a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily, well, at this point, it's not necessarily part of the assessment question, but it's certainly a factor to think about. And we'll hear from Patrick Chandler to see what CLEAN does as well, and they have a different kind of workflow that would contrast to what we're doing. So I'll just mention briefly what we do, and then so you get a sense of it. The important thing to know, I guess, well, I'll get to this in a second. The topic areas that we cover started with research data management kind of per se, but have been expanded a little bit to talk more about capacity building and data skills related to both a data life cycle and a research life cycle, and research best practices. Although the Data One Skill Building Hub is the one that collects those data, those practices at this point. If we get something in, we usually send it to Data One for the Skill Building Hub. But how to implement best practices is something that might show up in the clearinghouse as well, in terms of an educational resource or some way to learn how to do that. So what you see on the right here is probably too difficult to see, but this is a partial keyword list for the kinds of content that's in the clearinghouse. So you'll see there's a lot of data, the very first word. This is a controlled vocabulary, but I think one thing that's important is to note is that this is kind of a crowdsourced resource. So one of the things that is kind of sacrificed, it's a part of the trade-off of that, is the management of this kind of controlled vocabulary. We do manage that to some extent with the workflow process, which again I can talk about. But there are a lot of topics in here that and we've not found another one that really is that the community kind of manages that we can use in here yet, but that's something we're hoping to look for and find. But you can see is what some of the content topics are: data collection, data handling, data archiving, and as Rory mentioned, a lot of those that the WDS and ICSU came up with are very interesting topics too, and very practical topics. A lot of those show up in here as well. And there's a way to find those too, but that's not the topic for today. So the other thing to think about or to know about what's in the clearinghouse are the target audiences. We really have two. One are the people who need to learn, want to learn, and the second are those who teach. So what you see on the right here is the target audience list that we have come up with so far for the people who are to whom the resources are targeted. So that it ranges from citizen scientists to research faculty, but also includes people from a technology expert group, funding organization, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see the range is fairly broad for encompassing both those audiences. Then the spectrum of resource types that are there range from a media point of view, animations, collections of resources that might include a video, slides, and learning activities or exercises that would be considered a collection, or those atomic elements of a collection that would be either a data set or a slide set itself, a video, that sort of thing. So that's the range of the media type. And then the learning type range from full courses to, again, at those atomic units, a unit within a course, a lesson within a unit, but also demos, learning activities, curricula guides themselves, etc. So that gives you an idea of the, the spectrum of the types of things that are in there. There aren't as many full courses or MOOCs that, as there are of these other kinds of resources, but the idea is to be able to provide a way for people to find something that they need immediately or longer term if they're looking for a full certification or full degree. Again, less of the latter, less of the courses in there at this moment, but that can definitely evolve as those courses are becoming available and deposited. The other important things to think about are the fact that what's in the clearinghouse is the metadata about the content, not the content itself. So that where those resources are, would be someplace else, Zenodo or Figshare or some other websites. So one of the things we do as part of the quality checking is to make sure they're still there. So and then try to find why if they're not or whatever. But and then, as I said, the resources are aggregated and described using that volunteer crowdsourcing. And then the editorial workflow process allows for 4 different types of personas. One is somebody can, without logging into the website, just drop in a URL, a title, their name, and their email address in case we have questions. That starts the process of a review. There is a submitter who could also be that submitter person, but it has a login to the entire form, the metadata form, and can fill out the full form. Then a reviewer that goes through and looks at what was actually created by the submitter, and an editor then who does more of the work associated with managing the control vocabularies and the final stay there. So it's a process of moving through, and then it's published to the clearinghouse. We do not contact at this point the providers, the producers, unless there's a question and if we can find them. So it's more of a kind of a drop in that sense. And it's one by one, not a poll yet, a poll mechanism, which we hope to do at some point. But just to give you a context of what the reality is of what we've got here, as it would reflect as we could possibly do assessment at this stage. And I should say too, one of the important contexts about the assessment work is we're looking, as I said, we have a 3-year grant. So the year 2 and 3 are where we really will do what we can in the first phase of assessment, but we want to look longer term as well and see, what we can do with that in future too, given funding and community input and so on. So we're trying to be realistic, but also strategic and visionary. Okay, so what else do you need to know? So that's basically it. I don't know if anybody has any questions about that right now. That can come up in the discussion too, I think. I'm going to talk just very briefly about classic education approaches, thanks to Shelly, who gave me some leads here, since I'm not a professional educator in going through teacher school. But some of the common elements that, from a classic point of view, people use to look at resources and assess how the quality of them and the fitness for purpose would be these elements. So the veracity of the content, either scientific in our case or other kinds of topical areas, the alignment of the goals, activities, and assessment to those 3 things together with what the resource is and does, the way that it's presented in terms of pedagogy, or available to be used in pedagogy, whether it's for somebody just going online and doing their own, or actually teaching it in a workshop or other kind of setting, the robustness of the resource itself, its usability and dependability, given all the lesson components, and then often and usually that is the evaluation criteria and the answers to that criteria are represented in some sort of a review documents such as this example from the National Association of Geography Teachers. So that's a common approach. And then Carl is going to talk next about another approach to the Kirkpatrick model. And what we're trying to do with these is just sort of present what are some options and have you think about how, given the context I presented and what we've got, what might be feasible and what not, from both the point of view of giving potential users, meaning those two audiences, either a researcher or a teacher, information that would help them use that for their purpose. Okay. So, great. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'll give a shout out to Bill, who actually pointed out the Kirkpatrick model in one of our project calls in the last few years for one of our shared NSF projects that started me down the path of trying to look at it as a framework for looking at a lot of the different types of training work that we do in the library, and now certainly in the context of our IMLS data management training clearinghouse work. So this is just for reference if you want to track down either the historic elements of Kirkpatrick's model going back to the late 50s as the original series of articles that were published, some reprints and collations of some of those articles in the late 70s, and in this case this is the 2006 publication of the 4 levels, as Kirkpatrick's model is called, and some discussions around that. That is a current rendition of approaches to using this well-established and widely used approach, especially in training. And a lot of the materials you'll find is applications and case studies in the context of corporate training. But one of the things that I've found is that it turns out for me to be actually a quite intuitive and well presented model that I find actually presents a nice systematic approach to envision incremental assessment of materials. And the core of this 4-level model from Kirkpatrick are these 4 levels. Building first from reaction, which is a type of assessment that many of us are very familiar with in terms of that initial and immediate feedback from learners in terms of essentially their training experience that they just went through. How well did it meet their expectations and needs in terms of the subject matter, in terms of the quality of the instruction, the leader, and some other characteristics that may also be relevant to ultimately provide feedback to the trainers as to whether or not or what they need to do to improve the immediate learning experience, because that ends up being a prerequisite for effective learning. So if you are not able to create an engaging and productive learning environment, you're not likely to be able to achieve those longer and broader objectives that were actually, why you're bringing people into a training opportunity and why those people choose, in many cases, to participate in that opportunity. So in many cases, this is done in the form of a survey, preferably immediately after the instruction session itself, so that you can, number one, maximize your feedback in terms of the number of responses, but then be able to capture that information while it's fresh. This also allows you to start to establish and measure against an emerging standard for your own practice, or compare the performance of your training experience for your learners against other standards that you may choose to use. As I said, effective training sessions themselves end up being a means to an end in terms of trying to actually create effective learning. And when we're talking about being able to assess learning as the next step, the next level in this model, in this case, we need a set of objectives to measure against, to determine whether or not the learning that we're trying to achieve, whether it's in the area of building knowledge, skills, or instilling or modifying attitudes, we need to first determine what those things are that we're trying to affect or favorably impact. And this is one of the first areas where we need to start thinking very carefully about defining exactly what our objectives are, because until we have those, we don't really have anything to measure against. And at this level, what we're doing in the assessment is actually testing against those objectives to see how successful we were in actually succeeding in changing those attitudes, increasing knowledge, increasing skills. And so ideally, this is likely assessed in the form of a pre and post assessment so that you can actually get some idea of what the actual change has been, hopefully that can be ascribed to the training opportunity itself. And there's some mention in this and the subsequent levels about, if possible, using control groups as another way to evaluate those who have received training and those who have not, to have another way to gain an understanding of how effective your training is in achieving the learning outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Bottom line is, without objectives, we can't really effectively assess our learning, success in learning. Behavior is the third level. And this one becomes a bit more challenging in that it's one thing to succeed in achieving some learning objective in terms of perhaps modifying attitudes or instilling skills or knowledge, but it's another to actually have that learning process manifest in changes in behavior, hopefully in a desirable direction. And so assessment of your impact on behavior is necessarily a longer term and more challenging assessment method, because first you need to have a scenario in which you have an opportunity to actually see that behavior manifest. So if you are providing essentially a theoretical background for effective data management skills, if your learners aren't actually actively managing data in the immediate short term, it may not be useful at all or informative to try to assess how you have modified their behavior, because they actually haven't done that behavior yet. So timing is critical for trying to do this behavioral assessment. It also starts to broaden out the participants in this assessment, where you may also want to work possibly at the organizational level or peers, or be a little bit more creative in terms of being able to get an understanding of how behavior may be shifting, either at the individual or in some sort of composite way within an organization. But needless to say, this is probably one of the more challenging levels of impact that you're trying to assess. But it also is a necessary prerequisite, and I'll talk about this in just a second, for the highest level, the fourth level of assessment, which is results, where it's one thing to even change behaviors, but the ultimate objective in most training opportunities, and it's certainly the case as we talk about the training materials going into the data management training clearinghouse, is we're trying to achieve some results. We're trying to achieve higher quality data that is better documented and meets FAIR and other principles. And we need then actually some measures of what the indicators of those ultimate objectives are. And sometimes those might be referred to as key performance indicators or other terms. But ultimately, those are hopefully things we can measure and that we have some indication of through time. So again, we can make some argument for how the training that has been provided has some ultimate impact on actually moving the dial on these end results or impacts that we're trying to create. And in this case, sometimes it may actually be a little bit more straightforward to measure these, because these may actually be more amenable to the ongoing collection of metrics in terms of the number of data sets or rates of reuse, the frequency of citation of data in journal articles. Those are all examples of potential key performance indicators that we could bring into an assessment of whether or not we're successfully achieving the desired results of our training. Yes. Yep.
Hi, it's Stace again. So I was really reacting. I've not seen this framework presented in this way. I was reacting and taking some notes because I like these levels. I can give explicit examples for how I use the first 3 levels in my own assessments. But what I'd like you to just talk about is, like, I can see the application of this to the training materials, but then, so is the purpose for you as a clearinghouse to be able to have this kind of assessment for the content, or are you trying to do this kind of assessment for your clearinghouse? And that would be a little bit, it's harder for me to envision how to apply these principles to the clearinghouse as opposed to the training materials.
Yeah, absolutely. Our focus today is one of the assessment activities for the IMLS project with an emphasis on the content. So we have other conversations and discussions going on about how we assess the clearinghouse itself, whether it's in usability, the effectiveness of being able to discover content, those characteristics of the clearinghouse itself. But our conversation today is focused on the content and being able to develop capacity within the clearinghouse to be able to capture assessment information that we can both use to provide, we hope, enhanced information about the content of the clearinghouse, but also feed that, that information back to the developers of the content that may otherwise not have robust assessment capacity in their own organization or processes, where this is hopefully a value add that we can provide as the clearinghouse as an assessment layer that can sit on top of the content that is being collected in the made available through the clearinghouse. So yeah, thanks for that clarification. So I've already alluded to a set of key requirements for being able to do effective assessment for each of these levels. And this is just a reminder of some of the things that we have to have in place to be able to do this assessment for any of these layers. Also remembering that these are dependent upon the previous layer in terms of being able to have an effective understanding and comprehensive model for doing the assessment. So as far as the reaction goes, we need to have some idea of what our performance standards are so we can interpret the results that we're getting. For the learning level, we need to have learning objectives. We need to know what it is we're trying to achieve in terms of effective knowledge, skills, or attitudes that we're trying to instill in our learners. For the behavioral level, we have to have the target behaviors identified, and then based on those target behaviors, develop methods for being able to assess those. And finally, for the results, we need to identify what those key performance indicators are that are hopefully the final impacts and outcomes that we're trying to produce. And this final set of requirements translates into what is often a way to think of this in terms of an opposite approach. In terms of, in this case, thinking about it in terms of a theory of change. If our ultimate objective is to achieve a set of results, how do we work backwards through these various areas of training activities and assessment to actually be able to have a coherent and effective training activity? So I would argue that if, as a part of an effective theory of change that ultimately results in modifications of those impacts on those key performance indicators, we need to first identify what those are. Once we've identified those, we then need to identify what key behaviors in our target population, what those behaviors need to be. So, so we need to have a logical connection between those indicators and the behaviors. And likewise, we then need to identify what skills, knowledge, and attitudes those learners have to be able to effectively manifest those behaviors, which ultimately then informs the materials that we develop and the methods we use to present them to particular groups of users. So this ends up being an approach for flipping how we think about what we're trying to teach and have our learners learn, because we have to ultimately try to create that logical chain from what are the actual outcomes we're trying to achieve down to what we're actually doing in our training. So this is where it feeds into a set of questions that I wanted to seed you're thinking right now for, but will feed into our discussion, because in many respects, the variety of assessment approaches that we're talking about today, there are a lot of connections to asking some of these key questions. You know, what are the key indicators? What are the behaviors that we need to instill when we're talking about improved data management, data curation, data stewardship, documentation, all of those things that are near and dear to our hearts and are deeply embedded in the content at the clearinghouse. So I want us to be thinking about these as we go through the remainder of our presentations here and then as we go into the discussion. So with that, I'll invite Patrick to come up and provide his discussion on the clean network assessment. And do we have, yes. Yes.
So I'm a little concerned about whether it's possible to have assessment criteria that are common across the board, depending on independent of content.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, different content is addressing different kinds of audiences and different kinds of training.
Right.
So I was wondering if it's even possible to have a common set of criteria and requirements.
That's an excellent question, and Nancy and I have had some brief conversations about this, and it's certainly something that I've had to be thinking about as I've been trying to develop assessment tools for the variety of training opportunities and materials that we're producing as a part of our research data services program in the library. And it is a challenge, and there are a couple of approaches that have come to mind so far, and that's one of the reasons we're here, is to talk about, you know, where are the challenges, where might be some of the insurmountable challenges, and what are some of the other activities that we need to undertake to try to address some of the surmountable problems. But you know, one approach that I've been considering, especially for sort of the learning level, not necessarily going up yet, but in having a shared instrument that allows the learner to actually, in their words, express what their understanding of the learning objectives are, and then to do an assessment in the context of their understanding of what was trying to be achieved. That does not address that question of a standardized approach, but it allows us to potentially provide some initial indication of at least the learner's understanding, and then an assessment of how well what they thought they were supposed to learn, how well that was achieved. But that's in reality, that's a fairly weak indicator. Ideally, we would like to have some strong indicators centered around perhaps a community set of standards in terms of these are the particular skills and knowledge that we would like the community to have around these different topics. And then maybe go through the process, and this is something we've also talked about, of reaching out to the developers of the content so that they can help identify particular elements in their training materials for identifying which objectives are aligned with what they're trying to teach. So it's sort of an after the fact process, but it also then gives us a framework moving forward. So as new content is developed, we hopefully have a reference framework in terms of some shared or common learning objectives that can inform the development of new content, which then positions us in the longer term to be able to do more effective assessment. But this is absolutely a long game. Yeah.
So when I think about the Kirkpatrick training assessment, it's more at the content level. Individual pieces of content each need to have these 4 main elements. Mm-hmm. And then, so the rubric that you might be assessing an object is, do they have these 4 elements, and at what quality level is there? Mm-hmm. And then what you were just talking about, creating basically a core competency document. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are whole groups of people who do this as a living. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's great that you guys really do want to create that and think of it as a living document, because mm-hmm. new competencies keep coming along.
Right. And as a matter of fact, there's an exercise in tonight's reception related to yet another activity in trying to start down that path, but it's one of any number of parallel activities going on, and Nancy is going to bring that up as well towards the end. So let's go on and invite Patrick up, and let me see, do we need to change presentations here? Let's see, where did it go? Presentations. Is that where it went? That's somebody else's presentations. Where did that one get dropped? Nancy, where did the presentations get dropped? And so it's in the presentations folder?
No, in the folder, in the ESIP summer folder, probably, right? Where did you, I don't know where you dropped it. Do you have it in the stick?
No, it's dipped on the cloud.
It's
dropped in Carl's folder.
That's it. And this is actually a bit.ly that you can all use if you'd like to sing along at home. Okay, so let's. And there we go.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks, Carl. Appreciate it. And thank you all for the invitation to be here today. I'm just going to double check and pull up the GoToMeeting, because I think we are being joined by Katie Boyd. Katie, can you hear me?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, I'm going to turn your volume up a little bit. Can you talk one more time?
Yeah, I'm here. Hello.
Okay. Hi, Katie.
Hello.
That's great. All right. So Katie is the program manager for CLEAN, and I am the ESIP fellow working with CLEAN, which is the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network. A lot of my focus is on our community, even though I do work with the collection as well. Katie works a little bit more with the collection than I do, so she's a great resource to have with us. Her time is a bit limited, so I'm gonna get buzzing through here. I think it's interesting to follow up what Carl was just discussing, because I'm not sure there is that standard document that says what does good data management teaching result in? What are the frameworks that's established within? For the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, those frameworks were the Energy Literacy and Climate Literacy frameworks that were published in 2008, and also the Next Generation Science Standards. So it is a little bit easier in this realm of climate and energy to turn to something that's been established, that's been worked through by many great minds, to already focus on those learning objectives, behaviors, and results that are the goals of the best practices associated with these learning tools. So we're lucky to have these frameworks and standards to go by, and I think that question of what's the equivalent in data management is interesting, and it's an important place to start, because the CLEAN network started really in 2008 when the climate literacy framework was published, and educators in our group looked at it and said, you know, it's an excellent place to start, but it's not set up in such a way that your standard classroom teacher could grab it and run and pull off lessons in the classroom. So we wanted to create the resources and support that educators would need to do that. The CLEAN network is 3 parts that are interconnected and support each other. First of all, it's the collection, which is the resource repository that we've peer reviewed and vetted and held into this best available resources. Next is the guidance that accompanies those resources. And I think this is a unique and really important part. With every resource we take in, our reviewers add notes, tips, ideas for teaching in different classroom environments, any stumbling blocks that you might encounter using that resource. So that guidance accompanies both the resources themselves, and we have our own guidance documents for educators who want to address the climate literacy frameworks and the principles within. We also have our community, the CLEAN Network, which is a group of formal and informal science outreach and educators across the country that can help support any teachers who are using these resources or guidance to do that effectively. So starting off with the CLEAN collection, I'm going to go through all 3 parts of the network so you can see the interplay there, but I'll focus most heavily on the collection because I think it relates well to what you're looking at doing. We're at about 700 resources now, and that goes up and down a bit because we regularly look through these resources, and if they're out of date or if the standards have moved on, we do cut them out. So it goes up a little, it goes down a little. It's not like a constantly expanding set. Our goal is to really whittle it down to the best available at that time. And we're focused on middle school, high school, and undergraduate students. But again, we also work with informal educators. And you are familiar with the problem, especially with climate. If a teacher wants to grab a resource and does a standard search, the return is overwhelming and it's really hard to gauge what's actually valuable within that. So the CLEAN network provides a much narrowed down set of resources that have really proven to be the most valuable we could find. We judge these resources by the science they present, by the pedagogy involved in their creation, if they show best practices of teaching, and if they're classroom ready, if they're easy to use. I'm going to spend a minute with this slide because I think this process really helps to ensure we're presenting the best resources available within the CLEAN collection. So the first thing that happens is we're given a resource, and it can be by one of our partners or a member of our network, and the person who receives that resource will take a quick look at it and say, does it seem scientifically sound? Is the pedagogy good? Is it ready to use and easy to use? And if they say no, then it won't continue down this chain. So that's that informal triage there. The next part is Katie Boyd actually takes a good look at it and gets a little more in depth and say, does it really meet those 3 criteria? And if she says, yeah, okay, then it proceeds to a set of 2 reviews. These reviews are done by a science expert and an education network expert within our network. And they're pretty formulaic. We have a 9 or 10 page checklist that they go through in these reviews, asking specific questions about their science and education efficacy. And then if it goes through those 3 steps, it gets to our review camp. This is where we have 4 folks, a team of 4 that includes both scientists and educators, look at that resource and really add robust notes to it for teaching tips, really pick it apart and say, is there anything we need to highlight that might be difficult in a classroom? Which classroom environments and activities would this match with? And they also work to tag it for searchability at this stage pretty heavily. Even though that's done throughout the process, the camp is where that's done most extensively. After that, we send it to an outside science expert who can look at it with fresh eyes and say, is this science really the best available right now here? And finally, if it passes all those review steps, it gets aligned with the NGSS standards and cataloged within our system. if a resource fails at any part past that first informal triage, it's not as if we're like, okay, done with it, never again, you know? We put it on hold. So we contact the folks who have submitted or created it and say, hey, we looked through your resource. This is what we found a little bit lacking. If you'd like to address that and resubmit it, we'd be happy to take another look. So I think that's a nice way to provide feedback to those submitting resources. And finally, after we get that set of resources in for that current year, we usually do those review camps once or twice a year, depending on how many resources have been submitted and how many folks we have available to jump into that process. But at the end of that, when we've got this current set of resources, we try and review it regularly to say, what gaps might there be in the current version of the clean collection? Are there things that we haven't addressed? Are there new standards that should point us in other directions? And then we'll work to seek out ways to fill those gaps. That's a lot of details on that overview, but Katie, would you like to add anything?
No, I think you pretty well covered it.
Okay, cool.
Nice job.
Thanks.
We do have if anybody's interested, there is a paper on this whole development of the review process too that I can send to you, Patrick. So if anybody's interested on that part of it.
That'd be great. If you could send that and we'll share it out to the group. I want to take you through a couple views of the backside of this review process. So when we get a resource, it goes into the network in a way that sets it up to work through the steps I just described. And we'll say, okay, this is a new resource. We're going to give it an official title and a number, and then we're going to assign it that set of reviewers. And each time a reviewer gets through it, they go into this part of the system and add any notes, any tags, any information. And this also lets us track the path of that resource through the system. So we know who reviewed it, what they said. We can go back to them and say, hey, we saw these notes at any point. And this is another view of that where these are the steps in the process, and the green indicates that the step has been complete. The red is not yet. So this provides a really robust and trackable way for us to consider who looked at, worked with, made notes on that resource. On the front side, after a resource has gotten into the system, this is what the search looks like for it. Educators can put in filters based on the type of resource, on the level they're teaching to, and on the standards they're hoping to address. And you can get pretty specific using those filters. You can also just search by keywords, and that does a standard text search to look at each resource and tag those keywords. But it's, I think, a very effective resource search, especially because of the amount of reviewers who help tag those resources. This is, if they pull up a resource, if they click on any one that I just showed you, this is what comes up, and it's going to be a little difficult for you to see, but this says, okay, so this resource, the big overview looks like this. Here's the topics it covers, the big ideas in it, and then they can link to that resource. They're not housed within the Clean Network, though all the notes on them are. So this links to the external resource page. That's all I'm going to talk about on the collection itself. Any questions on the collection before I move on to the other two parts of the network? Great. Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you're covering this later. If you are, I apologize. But you mentioned that you also de-accession resources. So can you talk about the process for that?
I'm sorry, that we also
de-accession resources, pull them out so that, you know, you only keep, I think you mentioned earlier on that you want to have a good corpus of high quality resources in there. So you take things out periodically, but can you explain that process?
Yeah, and actually, Katie, since you're here, I'll turn that over to you. Can you talk about pulling resources out and how and the process?
The The main reason that we pull resources out is if they're no longer available. So we do pretty regular checks through the system on all the resources to make sure that the links are still working. And so, for example, like the EPA this year pulled down a lot of their climate change, or last year pulled down a lot of their climate change resources we had in our collections. We had to go through and archive those sort of out of the system. So when something gets old, and that's the main reason we take something out, is just because a link has become broken. We'll search the site, we'll look for an updated link for it, but if we can't find it, then we'll take it out of the system. And then periodically, a little less often, but every couple of years, we do a check looking for, we flag things with, if science, we think, if it's cutting edge science, so if it's something that might change in a couple of years, we go back through and look at those ones once they get older than about 5 years and say, is this still good science? We also get other people who might let us know if something's gotten old or whatever, but that's the main reason we take something out, is just because it's no longer available or it's gotten older and maybe the science isn't totally up to date. We'll look at graphs. If they only go up to a certain year, we might remove it, just as it gets old. So those are the main ways we sort of remove things from the collection.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Any other questions on the collection? Yeah.
Hi again. I don't know if you'll also stress this in further slides, but I was really struck by the difference between the framework that Carl presented and this example. And I was thinking about it in the context of, my understanding is Carl's framework was really having a focus on the learner's perspective. So on the self-reporting of learning and behaviors and such. While this assessment is focused more on the content matching to literacy principles from like an expert reviewer side. And so perhaps it relates back to, we don't have quite the set of literacy principles, as you were mentioning early on, to do that kind of matching to data management training, that at least that I know of. But I was just struck by the kind of like the two endpoints.
I was thinking of that when Carl was presenting as well, and I don't think there's a difference. It's just a different stage in the process, because that system that Carl presented is embodied within the frameworks, within the climate literacy framework and within the next generation science standards. They've addressed how to focus on learner objectives, on behaviors, on the results that are the hope of all of that. So I would say that work was kind of done for us by an expert community to address the learner specifically. And we have the great advantage of being able to take that and run with it to get to this system of addressing those resources rather than creating them. Does that make sense? Go for it, Katie.
I think that's a really good point, Patrick. And I think that that's part of where we look at the pedagogy side of things. We try to make sure that everything has best practices, including that idea of being sort of learner-centered if it is a classroom activity, because that's something that we, inquiry-based is something we really look for in our resources. So not necessarily in our review process, but definitely in the review of the resource, we'll consider that.
And I'm going to move forward here because I think this next section highlights some of our own focus on the learner in the guidance documents that we create ourselves. So this is the second part of the network where we're providing support for educators through our own network. And with each literacy principle of one of those bigger documents, we create a document that addresses what it means, what the stumbling blocks are for a teacher that was going to address it in the classroom, any confusions or misconceptions that are commonly associated with that principle, and then of course the teaching materials to dive into it, and a broader set of references. So I think this is our effort to address the learner. And the other thing that does that in the collection is the notes that accompany the resources that really point to teachers to say, okay, so you're in a classroom, 6th grade classroom, doing a set of activity looking at the greenhouse effect. How can you best address your learners in that context? Here's a set of guidance notes to help you accomplish that. So that's the second part of the Clean Network is these guidance documents. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because my time's already almost up, but I want to also mention the third part, which is our community. And I think it's incredibly valuable, not just to have a resource collection, but to have a group to go to for support that so a lot of the experts that created these resources are in that group. So if anyone is working through the collections and they're like, yeah, but you know, you didn't really address this, they can turn to the community and bring those questions up. We meet every week, every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern time to talk about new resources, to talk about tools, to talk about important questions that are coming up and address new ideas. So if any of you would like to bring up anything to the network, I'd encourage you to do that. Please contact me and we can talk about next steps there. It's a great community and I think it's invaluable for bouncing ideas off of if you're working to create climate or energy teaching resources. Those are the three parts I want to mention. In order to promote this, we do a lot of marketing, both on social media and through a couple other venues. We use web analytics to track how effective our marketing is, social media and Google Analytics mainly. And through those analytics, we found that we've been really effective at increasing the amount of teachers who are using these resources year after year. So with that, I've used my time, but if there's a question or two, maybe we can address it quickly while Katie's on the line because she won't be available to stick around for the discussion after.
Sure, yeah, we can take a question or two while I'm also changing up the slide for Sophie's presentation.
Great.
Oh, okay.
So to kind of follow up on Stace's question, so you guys aren't doing any, like, after you post the materials, an assessment of how they were received by the educators. Is that correct? Okay.
Not in particular on the individual resources. That we kind of leave up to the developers themselves, I'd say, to sort of look at how educators respond to their resources. And we don't change anything, you know, we can't change anything, we just provide a link to it. So in terms of feedback and evaluating the resources, that's kind of on the developers. And so the main way that we look at how it's sort of received is through the web analytics that Patrick mentioned. So we can look at like what are popular resources, what are ones people have bookmarked and come back to. We can look at, you know, where they're coming to the site, where they're finding finding the resource in Clean or whatever. So yeah, we do that mostly through our web analytics rather than looking at the evaluating the resource itself.
And I want to throw out there, the other way that I feel like we do that on the more informal side is through the network, because if we're posting something that educators are really excited about, they definitely let us know, and our group discusses that and might choose to highlight it a bit more. Also, if there's anything that isn't working for folks, we can hear about it and work through it via the network as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So to follow up on that, do you have ways of highlighting more frequently used resources?
I think the web analytics do that pretty effectively because
For other educate, like, so if you go into your collection, like, could I see, oh, this one's been used like more than others, so I might want to take a look at that?
No, you know, we don't have a way to search for that in the collection, but I will in different talks or when we present this to teachers, sometimes we'll mention certain ones that are more popular than others. But that's a good point, actually. I don't think we have a way to currently do that, but that's actually a good suggestion.
Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Pass it over to Sophie for her presentation. All right. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sophie Howe. As I mentioned during the introduction, part of this session. I'm currently with the Rona Institute focusing on empathy-based design approach. What that really means is that I'm really passionate about understanding the target audience, being able to understand their goals and finding ways to help them be successful with their goals. And so I find myself very fortunate to be in this ESIPS meeting and at this session because I think my research area really aligns with what we are trying to communicate this morning with all the plenary speakers, as well as what we are trying to do with the data management training clearinghouse. And so I'm really glad to be here. But I do have shortened amount of time for my presentation portion. So I decided to scrap my presentation. We're just going to go through Data One because I'm here to talk about my work with Data One. And I'm hoping that Carl and Bill and Amber will approve. So the agenda is that I'll give you a quick background on this tool, this education evaluation tool that we developed back in 2016. And this tool was developed really influenced by the Kirkpatrick method. So it's really important that that Carl gave us a background on that. And also definitely, if you don't remember anything from my talk, you just need to remember three things. One, Data One's website, which is right here. And two, the education evaluation tool, or EVA, is available on the website. And then three, it's free for you to download and take away. So please take a look, contribute, or give feedback. Data One would really appreciate that. So a really quick background. I'm not here to talk about Data One as an organization because, again, like I said, we have three members here who can tell you more. And if you want to read about the information, just go under About, and there are a lot of different pieces of information. And Carl is prominently featured under Leadership, so you can see that. And the other information I want to share with you is the Participate tab. This project, like I said, came out of the internship program. I was Data One's intern back in 2016, and this is really where I got the experience to develop this education evaluation tool. And so this is a big part of what Data One does. They provide education opportunities, but specifically, Data One provides data-related services and resources. So there are really three different types of resources that you can find under this tab. You can find in-person training opportunities. Obviously, we know in-person trainings can develop great relationships between the trainers and the trainees. So that is a really great opportunity for Data One to connect with its community. And the second opportunity is webinars. Obviously, making things more accessible to the users or to the audience is very important. So webinars really open up the reach of Data One's community, and that's a second education or outreach opportunity from Data One. And the third one that's really closely related to the data management training clearinghouse is the data management modules. This is a document-based, self-paced process that someone can go to Data One's website, scroll through this list, and decide which module that the person really wants to go through or incorporate into his or her training process. And these resources are all in data management training clearinghouse as well. So you have two different ways to access this piece of these pieces of information. But because Data One has these different types of training or education opportunities, there are really three things that Data One really is passionate about. One is really understanding whether or not these education tools or education opportunities are effective. But two, also looking forward and being close to the emerging issues or emerging challenges that the Data One community is experiencing, so that overall, looking back at their services, enhancing those services, but also adding to those services can overall provide very holistic support to the Data One community. So as I mentioned, because it's really important for Data One to provide data support and data services are aligned with its community. We need to understand how we can actually assess that. So going back to what I mentioned about understanding the audience, understanding their goals, and making sure they're successful. So assessment or evaluation is a very important process. And so
For this project, when we are creating the education evaluation, basically what we did was that we did a lot of a comprehensive literature review. We wanted to know what other best practices are out there for these different formats. Obviously, in-person training is a very different delivery format versus digital versus web-based. So first and foremost, we need to understand what is the experience that our users are going through. And once we understand what that experience is like, then we can develop the appropriate evaluation process. And also, as Carl has already mentioned, the content or the relationship our audience has with the training process is also really important to us. So we need to understand what experience or what objectives are really trying to get out, what motivations that they have, and and finally, with that information, we can then determine what is the way for us to track and ensure that we're helping them to be successful. And I'll just go quickly to the education evaluation tool now, because as I mentioned, Kirkpatrick structure was really informative. It helped us think through how we want to structure the evaluation tool, and also how we want to present the evaluation tool to our community. So under Data One's website, if you go to education evaluation tool is the last link. When you get to it, the first thing you will see is that we focus on the fact that there are these three modes that we were really developing this tool for. We were looking to evaluate in-person training or education events. We were looking to evaluate digitally served events, and then text-based or self-paced education opportunities. Also, because there are different time durations, durations are associated with these different formats, you can also filter your training or your assessment questions based on the training duration. And finally, you will get this list of different training areas that you can assess. And we actually have 2 different formats that you can download this training material or this assessment material, either in Excel spreadsheet or in document. And this is really just for whoever is wanting to leverage this piece of this tool to look at all the different questions and our suggested response type, so that they can formulate their own survey instrument or assessment instrument. So I know this is really quick, but as I said, we are short on time, but we really want to talk to all of you about the discussion questions. So I would just wrap it up by saying the EVA tool or the education evaluation tool is available from Data One, and this is used to evaluate 3 different training modes. And this training tool or assessment tool rather is structured based on Kirkpatrick structure or model that we talked about earlier. And definitely, if you are working in this area, we will appreciate your trying this out. There's no better way to experience this than just to download this tool, look through the questions, and even applying at your training event, and let us know your thoughts. Like I said, Data One and the Data Management Training Clearinghouse would really appreciate your feedback. So thank you very much for your attention. So
any questions from Sophie while we queue up the discussion? Yes.
Hi, Stace. I have a question. I looked through your question. I love these questions. I was not aware of this resource. I use Software Carpentry's resource, but I wouldn't be able to provide you results from my survey because I don't have an IRB for my project. So what kind of guidance do you give people regarding human subject research, use of survey instruments, and being able to share results of those survey instruments? IRB meaning Institutional Review Board for Human Subject Research.
Right, and that's a really great question, because that is an area that definitely we encounter once we made the tool available. And again, this is really why we talked about making the tool available, so that we are actually helping people collect data. But yes, human feedback or responses are definitely considered to be confidential. So definitely Data One cannot help in hosting that. So the feedback that we're really looking for is effectiveness of the tool to inform your process. And so we're not looking for the actual responses that you get from your users. So whatever process you need to go through to be able to implement the survey, definitely we recommend that you go through that. But as a result of that process, as a result of that lessons learned, we would be very interested in hearing about whether or not these categories were informative, whether or not the questions that we included or suggested were helpful. And we talk at length about choosing the response formats like Likert scale versus open text versus yes and no versus all the other options that you can have. So again, in terms of feedback, we're looking for if your users find the choices that we made actually helpful in terms of making this assessment tool effective. And Amber, please.
Oh yeah, I think my question was along the same lines because I was just curious because I haven't seen this before and I was wondering, so if I have a Google form or because we do little educational workshops with classrooms and whatnot, I was thinking would be good to put together a nice survey afterwards, but then this would just inform me to go into, Google Survey Creator and create a nice survey and then email it back out to the instructors. Is how we would do it? Or it doesn't look like there's a way that you can go in here and actually submit the survey or manage the surveying submission process, right?
It's more of a former, what you were saying, that our goal was definitely to help suggest the questions that you can use for your own evaluation purposes. So, and these questions, as you look at it a bit closer, you can actually do a pre-event survey and compare with post-event survey. So yes, the questions are definitely for you to use and the responses for you to analyze, to keep, again, and feeding back to data one is really more about the effectiveness of the tool. But yeah, I think Amber wanted to add additional information.
I was just going to follow up on that. Thanks, Sophie. So as Sophie indicated, we used the framework of the various resources that Data One has to think about the types of training environments, but the intent wasn't for these questions to be applied by you to our resources. I mean, we have done that for ourselves, and we also haven't used IRB because it's been for our own information and resource development. But we recognize that having developed a survey methodology for ourselves, our collaborators were asking us to share that, and we wanted to create a platform in which we could share it with a broader community, and that's what Sophie did. The Google Forms question, we wanted to put it as a Google survey, but because of the way that Google works and the sharing, that wasn't possible. And so that's why the Word document, you can kind of copy and paste and take what you like. It is also in Qualtrics, so you can download a Qualtrics file. And then if you work with Qualtrics, it's already ready to go. And you can just edit the questions you want to keep or want to drop.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. So as seems to be, especially the pattern for any sessions I'm involved in, they tend to expand to fill all the available time. So our discussion time is right now very limited. And one thing I was going to suggest, because especially we have some pretty meaty topics here, is that we potentially continue the conversation over a couple of tables over lunch. To be able to continue to think about some of these things. But I think, Rama, your question was critical in that it is one of our challenges, and Patrick highlighted this as well, is that we do not have a nice, well-structured understanding or definition of, the answers to this first question here. Yes, Bill? Oh, unconference, yes.
I was just going to say, this is like a really important discussion topic, and we have, I was just looking at the board downstairs for the unconference, and there's nothing related to education. If there is, it's boring and it's not worth doing, but something like this would be potentially very exciting if, somebody wants to write it out. Because one of the things that I think would be really important is if we could point to some example assessment documents, just to help people. So I was thinking, especially along the lines of going the 4 levels, something along the lines of what might be done to assess, let's say, a data management planning training, because it clearly, very easily reflects all 4 levels if you want to have an impact and so on. So if we could, identify a few things like that, maybe that we could share or post, that would be very valuable for folks.
Yes. Stace? Yeah.
No.
I just wanted to add, there is a document produced by the Belmont Forums education group that has laid out a number of topics and skills for its data scientists, but it's more like earth science data scientists. And I remember opening this document and thinking this was going to be my key to these are all the topics I'm going to cover. And it didn't meet my needs, but it is something I would want to look back at now after today's discussion.
One quick thing in response to that. That part of the last slides we've got here are some projects that are actually that are in process at the moment around the world that are working to develop competencies and skills. And I've got lists of them here. It's too hard to see right now, but those slides will be available too. We're being involved. One of them is the Go Fair project that's out of with a Go Train aspect to it. They're in the process of developing a curriculum guide. That's early going. There's another effort that's coming through the European Open Science Cloud that's called Fair for Skills. There is a group of people that are looking for developing terminology related to data skills for data stewards. And then we're working with the American Geosciences Institute to create a career compass for data stewards, which may be between data advisors and data service providers. And that's part of the activity this afternoon at the research showcase is to, kind of look at what the Fair for Skills people are creating, and then see what the community thinks about that. But I still think it'd be great to put up an unconference proposal. So we'll definitely do that and see if we can do that. But go ahead, Stace.
So I just had a quick question regarding the desire for the clearinghouse to integrate information about assessment with the resources that exist. And so, as a resource provider, we would be happy to put in some information about assessment and the rubrics that you use or you decide on. But my question is that, in the case of the materials that we have with Data One, the assessment of the material itself is one part of it, but it's the delivery of that material and how you might be able to capture that, because a lot of our materials aren't standalone. They're intended to be delivered, and the outcomes and the learning benefits of that are going to vary on how they are delivered and how they're used. So I just wonder whether you've given any thought to that kind of integration of the actual implementation and not just the resource as a static object.
Right. And that is certainly been an element in what remained sort of very preliminary discussions about what the actual assessment activity under the auspices of the IMLS project will be, because as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about the assessment related to content, delivery is definitely a part of it. But in that context, I would, I've been envisioning that more as possibly having an assessment tool available for instructors to use that would streamline the process for being able to capture that feedback, again, where they may not have their own capacity for doing so. But that may also be a way to, be able to move towards also that that broader perspective, that reference standard against which individual instructors and content developers can compare themselves against other materials and learn, and so it can actually become a more collaborative and sharing environment as well, but also being able to provide capacity that is not universally available. But that's beyond preliminary thinking at this point, but it's certainly part of our discussion in our working group related to assessment, which is still open to all who are interested. And so, yes, I encourage any and all of you to join us for the unconference that will soon be added to the calendar so that we can continue this discussion and help to develop a strategy for moving forward. Are there any other questions or comments at this point? Thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to further discussion.